At the height of the technology boom, a single Canadian company became so large that it accounted for more than a third of the entire value of the Toronto Stock Exchange. If you owned a Canadian mutual fund, a Canadian pension, a piece of the Canadian market in any form, you almost certainly owned a great deal of this one company. Nortel Networks employed roughly 90,000 people, built the equipment behind the world's telephone calls and the early internet, and was, for a moment, worth nearly $300 billion. Less than a decade later, it was bankrupt, broken into pieces and sold. And a country's savings went down with it. This is the long fall of Nortel. To understand how a single company could become a third of a nation's stock market, you have to understand how old and how deep Nortel's roots in Canada were. The company traced its history back to 1895, when it began as Northern Electric, the equipment manufacturing arm of the Bell Telephone Company of Canada. For most of the 20th century, it did the steady, essential work of telecommunications. It made the telephones, the switchboards, the cables, and the great switching machines that connected the calls. And in the second half of the century, Northern Electric, later renamed Northern Telecom. And finally, Nortel became genuinely, world-leadingly innovative. In the 1,970 seconds, it made an early and bold bet on digital switching technology. The move from older analog systems to digital ones. And that bet paid off enormously. Nortel's digital switches were sold around the world. The company became one of the most important telecommunications equipment makers on the planet, with major operations and customers in the United States and across the globe. It was a Canadian success story of the highest order, a company from a country often overshadowed by its enormous neighbor, competing and winning at the cutting edge of global technology. Canadians were, with good reason, proud of Nortel. It was proof that Canada could build a technology champion of true world rank. By the late 1,990 seconds, Nortel stood at the edge of what looked like the greatest opportunity in its history. The internet was arriving. The whole world was about to need vastly more communications capacity, more network equipment, more fiber optic systems, more of everything Nortel made to carry the explosion of internet traffic. Nortel positioned itself directly in the path of that wave. It spent enormous sums acquiring internet and optical networking companies, often paying for them with its own soaring stock. It rebranded itself for the new era, dropping the old industrial name and becoming simply Nortel Networks. The company was betting everything on the internet. Boom. And for a few extraordinary years, that bet made it one of the most valuable companies on earth, which is exactly the moment in every one of these stories when the ground begins to give way. Between roughly 1997 and the summer of 2000, Nortel's stock did something close to miraculous. It rose and rose and rose. At the peak, in 2000, Nortel's market value reached around $300 billion. And because Canada's stock market is smaller than that of the United States, a company of that size had an effect on the Canadian market that has no real parallel. At its height, Nortel Networks alone accounted for more than a third of the total value of the Toronto Stock Exchange's main index. By some measures, in the most extreme moments, it approached and even passed that mark. Stop and think about what that meant for an ordinary Canadian. If you held a typical Canadian mutual fund, it owned Nortel. If you had a Canadian pension, it almost certainly owned Nortel. If you held a fund designed to track the Canadian market itself, then by definition, a third of your money was Nortel. You did not have to choose to bet on Nortel. Owning a piece of Canada's economy meant owning Nortel, whether you knew it or not. The fortunes of a single technology company and the financial security of an entire nation of savers had become quietly the same thing. This is the detail that makes Nortel's fall different from an ordinary corporate collapse. When Nortel rose, a country felt rich. And when Nortel fell, the loss did not land on speculators and insiders alone. It landed on the retirement savings of millions of ordinary Canadians who had never made a single decision to take that risk. But the soaring stock price concealed a problem, and the problem was simple. Much of the boom was not real. Like many technology and telecom companies of that era, Nortel had grown enormously by buying other companies and paying for them with its own inflated stock. The higher the stock went, the more companies Nortel could buy, and the more it bought, the more the story of unstoppable growth seemed confirmed, which pushed the stock higher still. It was a loop, and loops like that feel wonderful while they spin, but underneath, the actual demand for Nortel's equipment was being pulled forward and inflated by a once-in-a-generation bubble. And bubbles do not deflate gently. They pop. In the spring of 2000, the great technology stock bubble, the dot-com boom, reached its peak and began to collapse. And the part of it that collapsed hardest was the part Nortel lived in. During the boom, telecommunications companies had borrowed staggering sums and ordered vast quantities of network equipment, racing to build internet capacity for a future of explosive demand. Many of those companies were themselves built on hype and debt. When the bubble burst, they could not pay their debts, and a great many of them failed. For Nortel, the consequence was sudden and brutal. Its customers, the telecom carriers and the internet companies, stopped buying. Worse, the world had been wired during the boom with far more fiber optic capacity than was actually being used. The industry had a name for it. It was called dark fiber cable in the ground, paid for and lit by nothing, carrying nothing. When the world already has far more network capacity than it needs, it does not buy new network equipment. Nortel's orders did not slow. They fell off a cliff. The wave that Nortel had bet its entire existence on did not just pass. It crashed down on top of the company. Nortel's losses in this period were enormous. In 2001 alone, the company reported a loss of more than $27 billion, one of the largest annual losses in Canadian corporate history. The stock, which had reached well over $100 a share at the peak, fell and fell. Eventually, it would trade for pennies. Hundreds of billions of dollars of market value, the value that had made a country feel wealthy, simply evaporated. Nortel began doing what declining companies do. It cut jobs by the tens of thousands. From a peak workforce of around 90,000, the company began shrinking year after year. A normal company, badly wounded by a burst bubble, might still have stabilized and survived as something smaller. Nortel did not get the chance because at this exact moment, while it was already bleeding, a second disaster was discovered inside its own books. In the years after the crash, as Nortel struggled to recover, something strange began to surface in its financial reporting. The numbers did not hold together. Beginning around 2003 and 2004, Nortel was forced to announce that its past financial statements had been wrong and would have to be restated. Then it had to restate them again, then again. The company went through multiple painful, embarrassing rounds of correcting its own previously reported results. Investigations by the company itself and by securities regulators in both the United States and Canada pointed to serious accounting irregularities. The most damaging allegations centered on something with a dull technical name and an ugly purpose: the handling of reserves. Here is the heart of the accusation in plain language. A company can set aside money as reserves against future costs. The claim against Nortel's leadership was that the company manipulated these reserves to control the timing of its reported profits. In the lean years, the allegation went, reserves could be quietly released to manufacture a profit that made the company appear to have turned a corner, and crucially, to trigger large bonuses for senior executives that were payable when the company returned to profitability. In 2004, Nortel fired its chief executive and several other senior financial executives for cause. The company that millions of Canadians had trusted with their savings was now publicly admitting that it could not even be trusted to count. The accounting scandal did lasting damage that went far beyond any single restated number. It destroyed confidence. Customers grew wary of signing long-term contracts with a company in financial and legal turmoil. Lenders and investors demanded higher costs to provide money to a company whose books had proven unreliable. The management's attention, in years when it should have been entirely focused on competing, was consumed instead by investigations, restatements, and lawsuits. Years later, in 2012 and 2013, 3 former senior Nortel executives would stand trial in Canada on fraud charges related to the accounting. They were acquitted. The court did not find the case for criminal fraud proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But the acquittal, years after the fact, could not undo what the scandal had already done. By the time of those trials, Nortel itself no longer existed. The damage had been done in the years when the company was still alive and still trying against an erosion of trust it could not reverse. There is one more element to the fall of Nortel, and it is the strangest, and for years almost no one outside the company knew about it. For roughly a decade, Nortel's own computer network had been thoroughly penetrated by hackers. According to a former senior Nortel security advisor who went public with the story years later, intruders had been quietly inside Nortel's system since at least the year 2000. The intrusion was not a brief break-in. It was a long, patient occupation. The attackers had obtained the passwords of senior Nortel executives, reportedly including a chief executive, and used them to roam the network almost at will. For years, by this account, they downloaded Nortel's most valuable secrets, technical research, product designs, business plans, internal emails, the crown jewels of a company whose entire worth was its technology and its ideas. The breach went on undetected or unaddressed at the highest level for the better part of a decade. Think about what that means alongside everything else. While Nortel was reeling from the burst bubble, while it was consumed by its accounting scandal, the very thing that gave the company its value, its intellectual property, its inventions, its competitive edge was, according to this account, being quietly carried out the back door the entire time. Whether the long intrusion was a decisive cause of Nortel's death or one wound among several is something that cannot be proven with certainty. But the picture it completes is a devastating one. By the second half of the 2000s, Nortel was a company being attacked from three directions at once. From the outside, a brutal, low-price competitive market where new rivals, including fast-rising equipment makers from Asia, were winning contracts Nortel once dominated. From the inside, an accounting scandal that had shattered its credibility, and from the network itself, a long, silent theft of the ideas that were the company's only real treasure. A strong, healthy company might survive any one of those. Nortel, by the late 2000s, was no longer strong and no longer healthy. It was simply trying to last. On the 14th of January, 2009, in the depths of a global financial crisis, Nortel Networks filed for bankruptcy protection. It filed in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. A giant coming apart across multiple countries at once. At first, there was hope that bankruptcy protection might allow Nortel to reorganize and survive as a smaller company, the way struggling firms sometimes do. That hope did not last. It soon became clear that Nortel would not survive in any form. It would be dismantled and its pieces sold. And so, through 2009 and 2010, Nortel was taken apart and auctioned division by division. One business unit went to one buyer, another went to a competitor, the wireless business, the enterprise business, the optical business, sold off piece by piece to rivals around the world. The single most valuable thing left at the end was not a factory or a product line. It was Nortel's portfolio of patents, more than 6,000 patents, covering core wireless and networking and internet technologies. In 2011, that patent portfolio was sold at auction. A consortium of major technology companies bought it for around $4.5 billion, a price far beyond what almost anyone had expected, a sign of how valuable Nortel's inventions still were. It was the final irony of the fall. Nortel's ideas, in the end, were worth billions, but they were sold for the benefit of the company's creditors by lawyers in the wreckage, long after the company that created them had ceased to exist. You can tell the story of Nortel as a story about the dot-com crash, the burst bubble that ended the boom Nortel had bet everything on. You can tell it as a story about an accounting scandal or a decade-long hack or a brutal new competitive market. All of those things are true and all of them helped to kill the company. But notice what they have in common, because the common thread is the real lesson. Nortel was killed by fragility. The hidden fragility of a company that looked from the outside, like a fortress. At the peak, Nortel seemed unstoppable. A third of a nation's stock market, 90,000 employees, a century of history, hundreds of billions of dollars of value. It looked like the safest thing in Canada, but that strength was thinner than it appeared. The value rested on a stock bubble that was not real. The reported profits rested on accounting that could not be trusted. The competitive lead rested on intellectual property that was, all the while, being quietly stolen. Nortel had built something that was enormous and brittle at the same time, and when the shocks came from the market, from its own books, from inside its own network, there was no solid core left to absorb them. No single competitor brought Nortel down. It was destroyed by the gap between how strong it looked and how strong it actually was. And a country, trusting the appearance, had quietly placed a third of its savings on the wrong side of that gap. At its peak, Nortel was worth nearly $300 billion and made up more than a third of Canada's stock market. So large that to own a piece of the country was to own a piece of Nortel. Within a decade, it was bankrupt, broken apart, and sold for scrap and patents. And the savings of millions of ordinary Canadians fell with it. The campuses near Ottawa are mostly emptied. Now, the patents live on inside other companies' products. The fortress, it turned out, had never been solid at all. Thank you for watching The Long Fall. If decline stories like this one interest you, the channel will be here.